What is the underlying asset of our modern system? Some say labor, some taxes. Some propose it's the machines or the metals. Yet since the modern age, the fundamental fuel in the machine has been debt. We live in a world of debt. The true scale of the modern credit system cannot be counted. It's vast and everywhere. Governments operate on perpetual debt, backed up by taxes. And yet if something were to happen to our credit markets, something truly detrimental, then the entire machine of modernity would seize up. More than a financial crisis, more than an economic hit, the machinery upon which our entire system operates would simply cease to run. Yet this has happened before. There is a pattern of credit expansion and collapse, a pattern of civilizations turning over in fundamental ways, a pattern of regime change, wars, and the fundamental rewriting of philosophical assumptions. And when these great changes happen, when the credit machine simply can no longer continue operating, great societies find themselves plunged into radical turmoil. The whole system changes. As the creditors of a nation find that they must recollateralize and reset, nearly everything in a society is touched. We appear to be going into another one of those periods. So let's explore the pattern. Let's take a look at what has happened before. We will see the tremendous consequences, as well as the marvelous opportunities. For the world as we know it is changing, and so many assumptions that we have rested upon for the past century are almost certain to go away. Let's take a look at what happens when the credit system breaks. This is the pattern of the great debt resets. A financial system is a curious machine. From the outside, it appears to be sophisticated, a mechanism of numbers, mathematics, an abstract network of trade and promises. It seems as though with all of these sophisticated players and grand institutions that it must be indomitable. There must be some inherent powerful reality that keeps it going. Some reason why some of the smartest people of our civilization operate it. But at its core, a financial system is something of belief. It's a network of confidence. It exists so long as participants believe that it has longevity, so long that its buyers believe that promises can be satisfied. People will continue to buy securities so long as they believe that there is value to it, and in that they must believe that there will be other buyers on the other end, that one day they may sell their assets for a profit, or believe in the case of debt, that not only will a borrower be able to meet his obligations, but that the asset to be delivered itself has some longevity of value. Throughout history we have built these marvelous machines, and though today our financial apparatus is so much more sophisticated than what we have seen in the past, throughout history it has been much the same. This monster will continue to grow and grow until it simply can no longer sustain itself. But what happens, as in the case of today, if a civilization is based upon its financial underlyings? If the state, the institutions, if society itself is dependent on the machinery remaining operative, what happens when it reaches a point where it can no longer sustain itself, where under the weight of its own unbelievability, it collapses? Well, more than a rewriting of asset values, more than bankruptcies, and more even than financial ruin, when a financial system, and particularly a credit system, reaches its end, society as a whole turns over. We have seen this many times in our modern age, yet its history goes back much further than that. Taking a look at the 4th and 5th centuries BC, we see a time of crisis, the plebeian secessions of Rome. It was a time of upheaval for the great civilization, where the underclass plebeians withdrew themselves, effectively boycotting civilization as a whole. They sought political and economic rights. They wanted the system to be reordered, and they wanted an end to their onerous debts and to their debt bondage. The patrician ruling class looked upon this underclass and realized that the system could not operate if they were to simply say no. that a strike of the underclasses would simply break it all. This period saw strikes and internal conflicts. Yet ultimately, as this system of debt bondage could no longer sustain itself, as the system was rejected and conflict reached a pitch, the ruling class granted legal reforms. The period of total patrician dominance was ended, and vast amounts of debt cancelled. This may be a much more crude form of what we're looking at today, but it is an early example of a financial political system reaching its end, and where in order for the civilization and its ruling class to continue, it must wipe away the debts of the past. This pattern we will see repeated, for when a financial system reaches its limit and can no longer be sustained, the debts must be erased. From a period of about 91 to 93 BC in Rome again, we saw the late Republic crisis. Once again, the system had reached its logical end. There was great plebeian unrest, substantial philosophical and social shifts towards populism. There were political reforms, particularly those of the Gracchi, and the erosion of the long-standing republican norms would lead to dictatorships, such as that of Sulla or Caesar. There was a redistribution of land, and citizenship was expanded. This time again saw wars, in this case civil wars, and during these civil social wars, a monetary crisis would arise. This would cause a credit collapse, and in the ensuing revolts, debt relief was demanded. In the year 33, under Tiberius, the crises that had arisen would see the state making loans to stabilize the banking system, yet there would be substantial private credit defaults, further fueling unrest. We are going to leave behind the ancient world and begin entering the Middle and Modern Ages. Here we will begin to see systems which look more familiar to us, but simply keep in mind the fundamental pattern. A social system grows. It is built upon debt. Eventually, the debt and the social system can no longer continue to justify themselves. It begins breaking under its own weight. Wars and conflicts emerge. The debts of old are wiped away, and new social rules are written. The new society begins under a new order, a new era, and all while the financial system restarts itself. The Black Death would be a major turning point for Europe. This period in the mid-14th century would, to great extent, act as the transition period from the medieval to the modern world. The Black Death killed so many of the European population that the old feudal social order could no longer continue. There were no longer sufficient laborers. No longer could the manors be maintained, for the population had simply shrunk too much. Following the Black Death, feudalism would decline, and the labor shortage that had emerged would empower the peasants. This newly empowered peasantry would challenge noble authority, and now with the peasantry seeing themselves in a new light, and having endured such social strain, new spiritual and philosophical beliefs would emerge, with certain millenarian strains within the movements. Around the same time, in Britain and France, the 100 Years' War had strained finances. This difficult financial position would lead to taxes and revolts. As the newly empowered peasants would revolt, the large and onerous debts that had been racked up over the previous period would be challenged. There was simply no way that the feudal financial order could continue. France would see debt cancellations in 1358, and in the case of England, during a peasants' revolt, debt records would be burned in 1381. Within England, there would also be partial debt relief. Up to this point, we still haven't seen a truly sophisticated financial system, nor the type of financial and debt collapse that we are looking at today. However, here again the pattern is the same. The system grows. It becomes more and more onerous as it attempts to sustain itself. Under these conditions, crisis emerges, and particularly exacerbated in the case of the Black Death. Wars and conflicts lead to the writing of a new social contract, and with the realization that the prior financial system can simply no longer operate, the old debts are wiped away to make room for the new system and allow it to begin again. The early modern period is where we begin to see the financial order that resembles that of today. Early on, beginning in the 15th century, a series of social crises would emerge in Germany. Within the Holy Roman Empire, the The Hussite Reformation, a religious and social movement led by Jan Hus, would act as a sort of precursor to the Reformation. The German people would demand church reforms, and this would particularly be prominent within Bohemia. And around a century later, peasants' revolts would emerge. This was a long stretch of social instability, as the German principalities were transforming from the medieval world into the modern one. Egalitarian movements would pop up, and the feudal structure of the Holy Roman Empire would be fundamentally challenged. The Hussite Wars would rage from 1419 to 1434, while the German Peasants' Revolt would occur from 1524 to 1525. As a result of this social turmoil, debts would again be cancelled. There would be a large-scale debt cancellation jubilee. Peasants would destroy archives containing debt records, and once again, we would see an old debt regime fall, a political order end, and a new social contract. Yet, in many regards, this would be quite mild compared to what would come. The following centuries would see the true transformation and solidification of the modern system. Within the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation would begin. Up to that point, the most powerful institution across Europe was the Catholic Church. While on the social-political level, people were largely organized into manors, principalities, and kingdoms. While the old feudal power structures had been challenged over the prior centuries, many of its elements still remained. Yet as religious conflict escalated, particularly within the German states, the princes of the Holy Roman Empire would enter into a profound power conflict. This was largely structured between the Catholic and Protestant princes. Yet, the balance of power struggle that would emerge would bring in kingdoms across the continent, many of whom not lining up on the strictly Protestant Catholic lines. For example, seeing the Catholic French king fighting for the Protestants. This had become a balance of power war, a political war, and the ensuing period that would be known as the 30 Years' War, from 1618 to 1648, would be a fundamental rewriting of the European political system. While kingdoms, princes, and lords would remain, the fundamental structure that would define the continent would be the nation-state. At the same time, Europe was financializing rapidly, particularly centered in the Italian states, some of the northern merchant states of Germany, and the mighty banking hub of Amsterdam. The modern financial order was being built. The sheer scale of social restructuring that would occur as a result of the 30 Years' War is truly staggering. The very concept of a nation-state that we have today was born of this war, and the Peace of Westphalia, which resolved it. And at the same time, we would begin to see elements of religious bifurcation. On the one hand, you had very devout and sometimes radical Protestants. Coupled along with them were the Counter-Reformation Catholics. Yet, in the following years, a curious new element would emerge. Europe would begin to see Enlightenment philosophy, and the early precursors of secularism. Along with the rise of this secularism and this rapid transformation of the financial machinery, a sort of financial religion would begin to be born. We now had nation-states run by bureaucrats, vast powerful banking hubs, and once again, as war would rage, debts would be cancelled, the obligations of the old order would be ended, a new philosophical, social, and financial order would take its place. The system built following the 30 Years' War yielded tremendous prosperity. The nation-state proved to be a very robust entity. The financial system produced fabulous wealth, and the great European kingdoms spread around the world, building the mighty modern empires that would stretch across all continents. Business was becoming international, finance was becoming complex, and the fundamental monetary system upon which these nations ran came to resemble more and more that which had emerged in Amsterdam, a system of perpetual taxation, where central banks are granted monopoly on the issuance of notes. Those are backed up by government debt obligations. The government pays for such obligations via infinite taxes. The system cyclically self-sustains. Taxation to pay debt, debt to make money, money to pay taxes. Yet the fundamental fault in this system is that it must continue to grow, and eventually it will outstrip the true, real asset supply. There simply won't be enough that is real for it to base itself off of. Taxes will become too onerous, and the ever-expanding credit system will simply become ludicrous. In the 18th century, cracks began to form. Taking a look at France, this great and powerful kingdom that had been the center of European culture for the past century, had become so badly weighed down by its tremendous debts. Its social order was beginning to deteriorate, and the Protestant nations were outstripping it industrially. The French Revolution, and the wars surrounding it, would lead into different forms of governments. While the medieval monarchy was overthrown, a revolutionary government would form, followed by a transitional government, the Directory. And then, out of the turmoil, one of history's great men, Napoleon Bonaparte, would arise. He would take the government into a new form, acting as first consul, and later as emperor of the French Empire. This period of warfare in France had emerged on the back of state debt getting simply too enormous. The tax burden carried by the lower classes was simply unsustainable. It was onerous and oppressive. The financial machinery had gotten away from itself. As a result of these wars, both the brutal internal revolutionary wars and the Napoleonic wars to establish imperial dominance, the feudal privileges of France's ancien regime noblemen would be stripped away, and the bourgeois middle and upper middle classes would ascend and in many instances assert themselves in the ruling class. The monarchy would collapse, a republican government would form, and be later replaced by the imperial structure of Napoleon. Secularism and Enlightenment liberalism would become the dominant philosophical substrate. A modern bureaucracy would emerge, with modern French administrative legal codes. Prior to the wars, a sovereign debt crisis had triggered substantial upheaval, and over the course of this period, the French currency, l'assignat, would experience staggering hyperinflation, and here we see the same pattern. The finances become simply unsustainable. The old social order erodes away, as wars and internal crisis envelop the nation. And just as before, in 1797, 2/3 of the debt would be repudiated. As a result of the Napoleonic Wars, similar debt repudiations would occur across Europe. For example, the 1831 debt repudiation in Spain, or the 1834 in Portugal. In Britain, the modern instantiation of the Bank of England would arise, leading to the modern structures of the City of London. Swiss bankers would assert more prominence than even before, and Europe would enter the 19th century imperial world. The financial order of the Westphalian world had ended. It had ended in its debts simply being unsustainable, and along with it, the social order collapsed. And with the backdrop of war, the old debts would be forgotten. They always come hand in hand. Social upheaval, a war that repudiates the debt, and a new social structure and financial order take its place. In the following decades, revolutionary fervor would sweep across more of the continent, particularly converging in 1848. Nearly all of Europe was either in a state of revolution or was involved in a neighboring revolution in some way. The 1848 revolutions would see an end to serfdom in many places. Workers' rights demands would be asserted, and in the place of Westphalian nation-states, principalities, and kingdoms, liberal constitutions would be adopted. A new philosophical system was emerging that changed the way that one associated with the nation. For centuries, people had simply had the embodied sense of being part of a people. They would recognize the social structures above and around them, for they were self-evident. They were those things which one owed loyalty and duty to. For example, their church, or their king. Yet ultimately, the political definitions between people were more commonly understood ideas like, I am of a people. Those are another people. Yet, at the time of these revolutions, nationalism would rise to become a new mode of thought. People began to think of themselves as part of a nation. The nation, a civic and social body, one associated with the nation-state. At the same time, republicanism would sweep across the continent, and in many cases where republics were not established, absolutist monarchies would change over to become constitutional monarchies. There would be civil conflicts across all of Europe, and particularly in the German states, we again saw debt cancellations, peasants burning debt records, and provisional governments promising debt cancellations. Although in many cases, these cancellation promises were later rescinded. We would see serfdom end in parts of the East, and by the end of these conflicts, Europe would look quite similar to what we understand today. By the early 20th century, the British Empire had arisen to become the undisputed dominant power of the planet, the French Empire weaker and behind, though still a magnificent force to be contended with. German industry was becoming a powerhouse, and the Russian Empire had swept across Eurasia. Italy had unified into becoming one kingdom, and the once great mighty power, the Ottomans, appeared to be on the verge of collapse. The foreign policy establishment of Britain, along with its business and financial ruling class, had for a long time wanted to ensure that neither Germany nor France gained too much power on the continent. Yet, perhaps more importantly, they wanted to check the power of the Russian Empire, and if possible, carve them up. Many interests were converging geopolitically, and particularly as the Ottomans were clearly in decline, there was quite a vested interest in seeing that the sick man of Europe die. Yet on the backdrop of all of this, the vast financial machine in London was entering a period of extreme crisis. There had been currency shocks, and quite pressing systematic risk within the gold-backed monetary system, and within the credit markets more broadly. It appeared as though, once again, the order that had reigned supreme for generations was reaching a point where it could no longer continue to justify itself, and the financial machine that had created unimaginable wealth, colonized the planet, and become the master of industry and resources, all while instantiating itself as the capital of credit, and the bankers' bankers, was at a point where its monetary and credit system would end. It needed to do the process that we have seen so many times. It needed war, it needed debt restructuring, and it needed to start anew. The First World War would truly transform how Europeans thought about themselves. The sheer scale of destruction was unimaginable, and it exposed to us that there was something darker that lurked within all of us, something which could not be unseen. Owing to the First World War, there would be civil and revolutionary war in Russia, collapsing the old Russian Empire and replacing it with the Soviet Union. The German Empire would collapse, with its monarchy dethroned and replaced by the Weimar Republic. The once prosperous German Empire would become a husk of what it once was. It would see hyperinflation on a truly detrimental scale, as well as debt cancellations in 1923. There would be debt cancellations and restructuring across much of Europe. Austria in 1932, Germany 1932, Hungary 1931, to name a few. The financial system of Britain seemed to have stabilized itself, at least for now. It had restructured itself, knocked out external enemies, been able to take over assets that could recollateralize the system. Yet it had left itself in a precarious spot. It was now dependent on constant cash flows from the defeated Germany, coming from reparation payments imposed during the Versailles Treaty. The new Bank of England system would emerge with a gentleman's agreement between the Bank of England's Montague Norman and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's Benjamin Strong. They would work to make sure that gold did not leave Britain, allowing the troubled city of London to continue to hold to its asset collateral that would otherwise likely leave. This period would see heavy use of interest rate manipulation, and all the while, the system became dependent on Germany paying Britain, and Britain paying back its debts to the United States. Ultimately, this system would prove to be unsustainable, and once again, the mighty financial hub and the powerful empire would find that it needed something in order to reset its system, and that's precisely what would happen. As a result of the Second World War, we would enter the modern institutional era. Welfare states would become a norm in Europe. Decolonialization would sweep across the empire. However, much of the financial control would be retained through institutions like the Bretton Woods banks, through heavy use of debt obligation, through stock ownership of national assets, and through soft power mechanisms. The Anglo-American liberal world order would become the undisputed hegemon of all the world. Once again, a war had allowed the old ailing system to collapse. In its place, though there would be debt forgiven, this reset would not require the full repudiation of debt. The city's financial machine had recollateralized itself with hard assets, and had created a new monetary order that would allow it to persist. The Marshall Plan would take American resources and reconstruct Europe. The Bretton Woods system would create a monetary order that would allow Anglo-America to stabilize and to assert monetary hegemony across the world. It would as well create international banks and institutions that would on the one hand ensure hegemony, but on the other allow for the same level of colonial power to be asserted without the need for direct state involvement, an empire purely of banks. This system would ultimately give way to the Eurodollar system, where London and later European banks would begin creating dollars. The US dollar would become the reserve asset of all the planet, taking pressure away from the pound to constantly expand its money supply. Via credit creation in the cities of Europe, and in particular London, offshore banks would create lines of credit with US dollars. These credit issuances would be rehypothecated, and ultimately this would create the modern era of globalization, as nations around the world could get very rich, borrowing at interest rates that were well below what would naturally occur within their home nations, lever that leverage up, constantly pay back and roll over debts in a currency that was constantly being devalued, as the monetary order demanded constant issuance of more and more US debt and dollars, perpetually draining away the purchasing power of the prosperous United States. Once again, the financial engine had kept itself alive with the same process: war, social change, debt restructuring. This time it was an external war, seizing foreign assets and integrating itself into the American system, restructuring its credit system, such that now it operated by constantly draining purchasing power from the dollar, and rewriting the social contract to the modern, liberal progressive welfare state. And that leaves us at today, for we are in precisely the same spot that all of these people have been for lifetimes. We see social decay. We see that our social orderings no longer hold. We have seen the cracks within the financial system get worse and worse. And all across the West, we see debts becoming simply ludicrous, all while the system of constantly extracting wealth from the US dollar, levering up and up and up, simply falls apart. The domestic US dollar is being cleaved from the Eurodollar. Debts across the West are simply going to collapse. And once again, the social financial machine must find a way to reset itself. It is, as it always has been, a war to reset, a new financial order, and a new social system. So now let's take a closer look at what has occurred within the English world, and we can explore the timeline that we are on within much more precise detail. Let's look at the large-scale system that we have been in for centuries. Let's take a look at the liberal financial system. We are going to begin our story with the Norman invasion. Prior to this point, England had existed in an early feudal system with its own unique Anglo-Saxon characteristics. The arrival of the Norman nobility would prove to be a quite substantial change. Under the new system of King William, taxes would become systematized, the power of the crown would take more central authority, and the new Norman elite would establish what would become the high medieval feudal system of England. One quite notable element of this story as well, and something that will appear more later, is that King William would formally recognize the City of London, granting to it unique independence, proclaiming that it should retain autonomy as if it were still an Anglo-Saxon kingdom, and thus began the medieval period that we tend to think of today. After a rather Game of Thronesy power dispute, the Plantagenet dynasty would dominate the kingdom until the 15th century. This is the medieval kingdom that we tend to think of, one with grand noble manners, one with the iconic images of knights and chivalry. Particularly after Magna Carta, a high degree of autonomy was retained by the barons, and the rights of Englishmen were enshrined. This financial system primarily operated off of feudal taxes. Yet over these years, the financial system would grow, particularly with the arrival of Venetian, Genoese, and Florentine bankers. Yet the Black Death would become a major turning point. As so many of the population were killed, the power of the peasantry leapt substantially. We would begin to see the decline of feudalism, as labor shortages would empower the peasants. Noble authority would be challenged, and the limitations of power on the king, which had already existed by this point, would continue to expand. As addressed earlier in the video, this would coincide with the 100 Years' War, and would be an example of debt erasure. This brings us into the Renaissance and early modern periods, where we would see a kingdom under the Tudor and Stuart monarchies. This period would see substantial financialization in the early stages of the empire, as explorational and colonial ventures would set forth. The East India Company would be formed, particularly in response to the trade ventures of the Dutch and the enormous Dutch East India Company. England would set out to become a financial and merchant power of its own. Yet the true financial sophistication remained in Amsterdam. The years of the Stuart kings would see an increase in the sophistication of early banking, as well as an increase in the sophistication of sovereign debt. But what would truly prove to be a demarcation would be the English Civil War. Prior to and following the English Civil War are very different financial periods, and particularly considering how short a time interval this was, it is quite striking. Beginning in the 1640s, the English Civil War would prove to be an irreconcilable dispute between the parliamentarians, many of whom were Puritans, and the Royalists. The fundamental social structure of England was being challenged, with Parliament looking to the king and asserting that he was abusive and tyrannical, ascribing to themselves what was fundamentally the ultimate sovereignty of the kingdom, while King Charles, on the other hand, maintained that the power of sovereignty was rightfully his. The ultimate clash that would light the powder keg of the Civil War would begin with King Charles' decision to reconvene Parliament after asserting an extended period of self-rule without calling the body. The reason that he would call Parliament was his need for revenues. He needed money. In fact, it's quite remarkable how many civil wars begin with financial disputes in the government. Over the course of the war, England would develop a system of state-backed loans. There would be a rapid growth in short-term credit instruments. Parliament would begin acting as a sovereign debtor, beginning to adopt many Dutch financial models, and becoming heavily financed by them, originally with both sides of the conflict receiving Dutch financial support, yet with a clear preference for the parliamentarians later on. The Dutch were seeking to draw closer to England, and to influence it to whatever extent it could. It had adopted a very sophisticated financial system, one with early forms of a stock market and central bank. As the parliamentarians would emerge victorious, and Oliver Cromwell would reign as Lord Protector. Very different, not to be confused. It would become clear that the social order was being pulled in two different directions. On the one hand, the rising merchant class was beginning to look toward the Dutch model, toward the vast trade networks, toward the large companies and banks, and began to financialize the country in a more continental direction. The middle class was becoming dominant, and the country had quite clearly left the old feudal world behind. Yet at the same time, it became clear to Cromwell that this Dutch financial power was a threat. He knew that for the sovereignty of England, he would have to make some difficult choices that wouldn't be popular with the merchant financial classes. By the time he began as Lord Protector, the first of the Navigation Acts had been enacted, beginning 2 years prior. These were a set of laws designed to guarantee English sovereignty and supremacy on the sea, creating trade and maritime restrictions. Ultimately, Cromwell would be forced to make a choice. The English Civil War had proven to be another one of these transformative periods. The transitional period between the feudal and modern orders had come to an end. The old arrangement, particularly that between Parliament and the King, had proven to be unsustainable, and the remnants of the feudal taxation system insufficient to compete with modern financial powers like the Dutch. When we come to more of these transition periods, keep in mind the idea of unsustainability. The promises and arrangements of the old system can just simply no longer sustain. If he wanted England to grow, and to keep the financial classes happy, he would have to act more like the Dutch, and engage more with Amsterdam. Yet if he wanted to maintain sovereignty, he would have to put up restrictions and push out financial influences, in a situation that is quite reminiscent of some of those we are facing today. Ultimately, what would emerge would include a degree of financialization and mercantile modernization, yet Cromwell had chosen to ensure English sovereignty. This would set England up going forward, and after his son and successor proved to be incapable of taking his place, England would call out for the return of the Stuart kings, and thus would begin the Restorationist period, where the foundations of England's modern debt system would be created. The restoration of the Stuart monarchy is a very curious period. On the one hand, with the return of King Charles II, it was clear that under the new social order, the power of the king was to be more limited. Yet at the same time, it was a clear demonstration that the social norms of the Puritans were simply unpalatable to the English people. To a great degree, people wanted fun again. Now, there is a perception of King Charles II as a sort of drunk, fun, jovial, womanizing party boy. Very likable and friendly, fundamentally good-natured, being known as the Merry Monarch, but unserious. This appears to be an incomplete evaluation. Yes, he was many of these things, but he was many of these things outwardly. What appeared to be happening, at least to some great degree, was that he didn't want to appear to be making too many power moves, to be too active and acting too monarchic. So instead, he'd simply go out to the public and say, "Oh, it's just me and the hot girls. Oh, don't mind us, we're just drinking wine," while actually being a lot more serious in the background. The new social order was a limited monarchy, one where the parliament was clearly the rising power, and one where sovereign debt became a substantial market. Under Charles II, he would begin asking Parliament for money. Sometimes they would give this to him, yet many times they would refuse to raise taxes for him. When he would get agreement from Parliament, he would begin to realize that he could go to the goldsmith bankers, goldsmiths who had, at this point, begun forming banking businesses by lending out their gold, and he would trade them promises of the future tax receipts in exchange for gold up front. He would take a discount, which was ultimately the discounted time value. Yet over time, what he would come to realize is that Parliament didn't actually have to approve any new taxes for him to do this. He could begin going to the goldsmith bankers and simply selling them future tax receipts. It didn't matter if Parliament had approved them or not, for this was a promise for a payment in the future. He was selling what was functionally a sovereign bond, and over time, a market for these obligations would emerge out of the goldsmiths. They themselves would begin selling those obligations at discounts. So we ended up in a place where the king needed Parliament to get revenue that would come from taxes. Regardless of the future reality of such taxes, or even the assent of Parliament, he could go to the bankers, and he could receive gold by promising them future tax receipts. They would take these promises, which were physically denoted on little bits of wood called tally sticks, and they would turn around and sell that at a discount to the broader market. This is rather primitive, but ultimately the same thing as the sovereign debt market that we have today. There isn't much fundamental difference between King Charles Wood and the US Treasury note. Over these years, a permanent excise tax would be created, forming the beginning of a standing, permanent tax base, and this paved the way for a longer-term borrowing. Under the new restorationist system, taxes were the base of long-term debt obligations, and those debt obligations fueled a powerful banking class in London. This is really where our modern system begins to form. Yet throughout the 17th century, the Anglo-Dutch Wars would force increasing financial sophistication. England would adopt more Dutch financial methods, and with this financialization, the banking class would grow rapidly. Merchant banking would become an enormous industry in the kingdom, and bills of exchange would become an enormous market. One thing which is very striking here is despite the quite substantial hits to the nation, Dutch finance would be able to endure in a way that those of other nations could not. This durability was owed in great part to the diversification of their debt portfolios. This diversification as well kept interest rates low, and though the Dutch had developed this first, this is something that England would begin to adopt, and this is where we see the introduction of distributing the credit risk of individual borrowers across a market. Instead of a creditor holding a couple individual loans, he would own a portfolio of many loans, thereby making his portfolio not particularly exposed to the risk of any one borrower. With this diversification, with this rapid rise of merchant banking, with the increasingly evident supremacy of Parliament, and with sovereign debt markets becoming larger with longer-term debt obligations, we would see a system of perpetual debt. This had first arisen in the Netherlands. The system is quite simple. A bank issues currency. That currency is based off of the debt of the sovereign, and the sovereign funds that debt via taxes. The sovereign never pays back the debt, and instead maintains the supply of obligation, and in turn bases that off of perpetual taxation. The taxes never end, the debt never ends, the money never ends, and this would make its way to England. The Glorious Revolution would fundamentally solidify the modern system. In it, Parliament would take clear control over finance, ending the systems used by the Stuart kings. In 1694, the Bank of England would be established, and during all of this time, there would be enormous banking and credit market expansion. Backed by Dutch money and the Dutch financial ruling class, William of Orange would be brought in as king, ruling jointly as co-monarch with his wife, Queen Mary. This period is quite interesting, as it does not fall into the same category as other events that we have looked at. This was not a system reaching its logical end, but more so just a decay of the prior system, which external influences, as well as internal movements and power jockeying, were able to take advantage of. Here many elements of great pride were established, such as the English Bill of Rights. It was also a clear affirmation of a Protestant nation. However, at the same time, something crept in. The system had become fundamentally financialized, and now a foreign financial class was directly in the throne room. The following years would see enormous power granted to the City of London, and the Dutch perpetual debt system would be instantiated as the underlying machine upon which the system ran. Ultimately, the Bank of England would be given a monopoly over the creation of money, and the system would be that the government remains constantly in debt. That debt would be monetized by the Bank of England. That would become the money supply, which would be levered up and up by the London banks, all while new taxes are collected by Parliament, which are used to pay back the old debt, or really more to maintain the image that they could. For in this system, they never really have to pay back the debt. They just have to go deeper into debt. It's a system of paying off the credit card with another credit card, over and over and over. Yet taxes at least give some fundamental underlying believability to the whole thing. And thus, following the Glorious Revolution, the Bank of England and the perpetual debt system would be born, all with the rise of new banker lords. Over the 18th century, the empire that would develop would dominate the planet. The financial system would be absolutely enormous, and the banking class would quite clearly displace the traditional nobility. The old nobility were bought out, bankrupt, and most of those who remained began to be absorbed into the new system. A very clear new social order and financial order had been created at the Glorious Revolution, complete with new institutions, a fundamental new relationship between the people, the government, and the banks, and ultimately, a new ruling class. By the time of the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars, this system had expanded for quite some time. It was a very financialized empire, with much of how it operated dependent on the machine in London. By the end of the Napoleonic Wars, sovereign debt had exploded to be over 200% of GDP. The war made heavy use of the bond market to finance itself, and had as well instituted an income tax in 1799. Fearing monetary crisis, the Bank of England would suspend gold convertibility from 1797 to 1821, very clearly demonstrating that a purely financialized system was possible to run. The system had grown enormous. It had become overstretched. Yet with the Napoleonic Wars, a truly financialized system could be created. Threats posed by the French were pushed down, and the system was adjusted to where the merchant banks would become the clear masters of the empire. Financial hegemony was becoming absolute, and a new class of imperial merchant bank was ascending. institutions like Barings and Rothschild. The system had once again used a war to enter a new age, and the system that would ensue would be one of extreme financial complexity and degrees of derivative removal. Over the 19th century, the Empire took over the planet. It was indisputable. The Empire was the #1 force on the Earth. It operated to great extent as a distributed trade network, one with vast industries and infrastructure projects. Yet the system it ran on was based on ever-expanding debt, and on derivatives markets. Fundamentally, the social order was one where the financial ruling class had fully displaced the old nobility, one where the monarchy had become symbolic, one where the parliament was sovereign, and one where the mighty banks dominated the empire. It had become quite dependent on cheap commodity producers across the world, and on the banking system's ability to create money, to profit through currency arbitrage, and to manipulate commodity prices. The ability to keep down commodity prices, and to maintain mastery over markets using derivatives, was dependent on that ever-growing credit supply, and that supply was contingent on the perpetual debt system. Yet unfortunately, as has always been the case in history, eventually your system just gets away from you, and that perpetual debt system had proven that it was just no longer believable. Financial crisis had begun to emerge in the 1910s, and the external order presented some threats. The Russian Empire was showing itself to be a true and powerful force. Meanwhile, the powerful industrial Germany appeared to be threatening the delicate balance of power that had been maintained on the continent, a balance of power that was very important to the foreign policy establishment. It became quite clear that many interests were converging at once, and that the only way forward was war. As a result of the First World War, there would be an enormous state expenditure. The gold standard in the banking system would be heavily strained, and there would be a heavy amount of monetization on the part of the Bank of England. Most of the war debts, however, were syndicated by the private banks of London, with the creditor, in most instances, being Wall Street. This period would see the rise of Wall Street as the dominant creditor, and would establish the Wall Street banks as global powers of their own. The United Kingdom would shift from being a creditor to a debtor, while the United States would emerge as a creditor. While this war did manage to address many of the external order issues faced by the empire prior, there were still many financial issues still remaining in the system. Meanwhile, the Germans had not fully been knocked out, and the influence that Britain had hoped to establish in Russia over the course of the Russian Revolution and Civil War would not go quite as planned, as the Soviet Union that would rise would appear to be just as much of a threat as the old Russian Empire. Though the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York would operate under gentlemen's agreements in order to try to control monetary flows and to try to keep gold in London, this arrangement proved to be insufficient. Meanwhile, the credit system that had developed between Great Britain and the United States had become dependent on German reparation payments. At that time, the United States was the place to put your money. Europe had been so decimated, and the United States was an industrial powerhouse. It was really the only investable place. At this point, Britain was keeping their rates artificially high, and had returned to the gold standard. At the same time, as per their gentleman's agreement, the New York Fed was keeping rates artificially low. All the time, European economies were weak, and the heavily integrated New York and London financial systems were dependent on Germany's ability to make reparation payments. As large amounts of capital were flowing into New York, all while rates were artificially low, eventually the Federal Reserve banks were forced to raise rates, and in order to meet their needs, Britons and Europeans would take money back. Around this time, London would see a stock market crash, and with a weak dollar and rising rates, the ground would be set for a Wall Street crash as well. With all of these problems still remaining, the problems of the old system were far from resolved. And thus, as we have seen throughout history, it's no great surprise that the Second World War would ensue. The Second World War would lead to total financial mobilization. There would be financial repression regimes, such as interest rate caps and forced bond purchases. Capital controls would go up across the world. And yet what would come from this war would be the utter destruction of Germany, and the ability for the London financial system to recollateralize itself, and more than that, for the imperial institutions to park themselves in America. The financial institutions, the ruling class, the foreign policy establishment, all of it would make its way into the United States and reset itself anew. The resulting Anglo-American order would see the Bretton Woods system initiated, one with vast international banks that could carry out soft power approaches to foreign policy goals, a Marshall Plan which would use American resources to rebuild Europe, and ultimately the Eurodollar system, the new mechanism by which the system would keep itself alive. The United States, following the banking acts of the 1930s, would now have a true central bank system, one which had adopted the perpetual debt and tax system. It had fully adopted the system that was once in Amsterdam, then London, and now with a shared ruling class, shared foreign policy objectives, shared financial institutions, shared intelligence gathering, shared military and defense, and a shared common world order. This system had reset itself and now lived in New York, Washington, Langley, and still London. And that leaves us with the world that we have today, one with the rise of welfare states, with the liberal progressivist system and the new social contract written following the Second World War, one of vast administrative states, of financialization and globalism, one that preaches an international brotherhood of man, of the Anglo-American rules-based order, where the hegemon must enforce its rules, one of vast pension schemas, of high taxes, and at the heart of it all, the US dollar credit market. Social discontent had gotten very high prior to the war. The old social agreement was no longer holding, nor were the old financial obligations. The new social agreement would be one of freedom from obligation, where everyone is viewed as an individual, free from his unchosen bonds, and free from distinction. Everyone the blank slate man. Once again, the inherent impossibility within the credit system had to be reset. The external order was no longer sustainable, and the social agreement could no longer hold. And that has been the last great debt reset before now. And it increasingly looks evident that we are going into another one. The United States would begin its history quite differently. At the beginning of the country, the debts racked up over the course of the Revolutionary War were quite burdensome. At this point, the states were still quite loosely federated, and they each had their own unique debt burdens. In 1790, the Funding Act would assume state debt, beginning a period of federal debt. In 1792, a financial crisis had emerged. Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton would step in. He would buy government debt securities, lend against collateral, and allow for deferred tax payments. This was the United States' first bailout, and he would stabilize the crisis. While things would be shaky for the early nation, things would continue to move forward. The system in the United States was quite different from that in Britain. The founding thinkers, like Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson alike, though disagreeing on many matters, were fundamentally aligned in opposition to the Dutch-style perpetual debt and tax system. What would emerge is Hamilton's system of political economy, a system of freer banking. There would be periods of national banking, where government-chartered national banks would be created. Yet during the first half of the 19th century, there would also be periods where no such system existed, and banking was entirely free. National banks would go through periods of being chartered, and sometimes not renewed. The nation was attempting to find its own path, and develop the American system. It would be one of national mobilization, of trade restrictions and protection, and one that was fundamentally closer to the older English system, and one where banks were more like utilities, free of the control of a rent-seeking financial class. This system, however, was subject to more vagaries, and particularly for such a young nation, problems would of course emerge. In 1841, there would be several state defaults. This would lead to wide-scale debt repudiation and restructuring. And again, owing to the Civil War, the Union would repudiate Confederate debts. The following years would see different banking systems emerge. One, a national banking system. The 1863 and 1864 National Banking Acts would create nationally chartered banks, ones which would lay the groundwork for what we think of as the US dollar today, national bank banknotes, backed by holdings of government debt securities. It's important to note, however, that this was a national banking system and not the private central banking model that we have today. Yet, following financial crises in the 1890s and the early years of the 20th century, an argument for a central bank would continue to mount. At the same time, the financial interests in London were drawing closer to the United States and attempting to exert influence. Many players wanted a central bank, and in 1913, the Federal Reserve System would be created. However, this was not the Federal Reserve we think of today. This was a network of multiple regional banks, each with its own interest rates, and banks responsible for backstopping the commercial paper market, and not the treasury market. Yet, the First World War would soon follow, and over those years, Wall Street would rise to become a major international creditor. The new system was now an early form of central banking, though regionalized. Following the war, in an effort to cooperate with Britain, the Fed governors, and particularly the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's governor, Benjamin Strong, would keep interest rates artificially low, leading to a depressed dollar. At that time, there would be a massive influx of capital, as so much of Europe was destroyed. And with this fundamental repricing, artificial currency pricing and interest rates, and an enormous amount of outstanding loans contingent on the ability for Germany to repay, a financial crisis would emerge in 1929, along with the following Great Depression. Franklin Roosevelt would step in with a new social contract, one of a vast administrative state, one where the regional Federal Reserve network was ended, at least functionally, and replaced with one great powerful Federal Reserve, which was, in practice, centralizing it around New York. Progressivism had dominated the country. It was becoming much more socialist, with vast sweeping centralized projects, very heavy-handed regulation and bank control, and a removal of much of the prior ruling class. A new system was being enshrined, and it was progressivism. It was the managerial state. Now, the central point in the lives of the people was the government. Prior to this, the idea that you could live your life dependent on the government and not a family was completely unfathomable. Yet with all of the new welfare programs, it became such that one could depend on the government. The state was now central, and banking too was central. The post-war order would see the Anglo-American system, where the United States would take on much of the British Empire's financial machinations and its foreign policy aims, with the new focused enemy being the Soviet Union, ultimately a continuation of Mackinderist policies. The United States would gain enormous financial hegemony, all while London continued to run its toll booths, arb currencies, and manipulate derivatives. The United States would become the enforcement arm of the Anglo-American liberal world order, and the new ordering demanded a constant war footing in the United States. Its military-industrial complex had become enormous, and its intelligence agencies acquiring more and more power. A vast sprawling offshore banking web would form, with power centralized in DC, Langley, and London, American troops all around the world acting as hard power, the international banks and diplomatic web functioning as soft power, the intelligence agencies operating in the shadows, and the powerful financial families firmly on top, as the underlying machine of this order was credit. In this system, nothing was more powerful than being the one who controlled the issuance of credit. All the while, vast criminal networks would form, and the offshore banking havens would develop enormous fortunes, hiding assets and engaging in money laundering. As the 20th century went on, the scale and sophistication of this web would become enormous, with the intelligence agencies, military, financial institutions, international banks, and the overall influence of the Anglo-American liberal world order everywhere on the planet. The only real threat, the Soviet Union. As Eurodollar offshore lending would rise, leading to foreign banks becoming enormous printers of US dollars, the purchasing power of Americans would become drained. Yet in the mid-century, this was still somewhat mild. In 1971, US dollars maintained gold convertibility, yet as offshore banks were creating enormous quantities of dollars via credit creation with much more lax terms than existed in the United States, claims against US gold became simply impossible, and under President Richard Nixon, gold convertibility would end. The following fiat period would see the most rapid expansion of finance ever in history. The Eurodollar system would spread across the world. Finance and industry was being globalized, with the dollar being exported across all continents. This got many countries very wealthy, as they were able to borrow at artificially low rates. Yet, all the while, in order to liquefy the system, the US government would constantly have to take on more debt, and as more and more dollars were printed, American wealth was being drained. The 1970s would see a wave of offshoring, as now not only the financial prosperity of Americans was being drained, but their businesses were being shipped away, their towns were being hollowed out, and the once thriving industrial core of the United States left to rust. The promises of the liberal order were being shown to be untrue. Prosperity was not arriving. The rest of the world was getting wealthy, and Americans were losing quality of life. They no longer believed that their children would have better lives than them, and it seemed the only real winners in this system were the bankers. The bankers, who in many cases weren't even in the United States. For the white working classes, their towns were destroyed, their wages depressed, and their savings eroded, while the progressivist promises of the 1960s would destroy the families of black Americans, obliterate the institutions they were building, and drive them into a new sort of serfdom. And all the while, the lower classes were sending their sons off to die in wars for financial hegemony. The great breaker of chains that claimed that it would liberate all people was merely destroying the unchosen obligations that brought meaning to people's lives for all of history. In the place of men who had families, churches, a people, responsibilities, and loyalties, you had atomized individuals, slaves to their whim, wards of the state, and fundamentally feeling more and more hopeless. The social contract was proving to be a lie. In the 1980s, the period of rising interest rates, the rapid credit expansion, and the improper pricing of risk would lead to the savings and loan crisis, the first true financial crack in this era. Yet, it wouldn't be until 2008, when the global financial crisis would shake the world, that it would become clear that this system would not last forever. Fundamentally, this crisis would not only destroy American financial institutions, but it would destroy the access to credit that the middle class had enjoyed. The mortgage system would be hollowed out. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac would be drained by the government, and the last vestiges of true sovereign independent finance, the long end of the yield curve, and the demand created by American middle-class borrowers would be evaporated, particularly in the United States, as cracks within mortgage portfolios would be a major driver. The system would be clamped down, the money hose would be turned on, and the financial system that would exist following the crisis would exist in a perpetual state of crisis management, just hoping to keep the impossible system going for as long as possible. And as this came to a head in 2019 with the repo crisis, as well as the following lockdown period of international liquefaction, the endgame began to manifest. The Federal Reserve would begin raising rates, and emerging in 2022 and 2023, the Eurodollar system was really in question, and as SOFR became instantiated, the pricing mechanism of the London banks would cease to exist. There was now a true conflict, for American financial sovereignty would destroy the fortunes and the power of the entities who had dominated the world for centuries. American financial sovereignty was the end of the soft power vestiges of the old territorial empires of Europe. And following the 2024 election, this fundamental conflict has been on full display. And now different futures appear visible on the horizon, and there are very different paths which the United States could take. Yet one thing is evident. This system, as it has existed, has reached its end. We have seen this financial machine create vast fortunes and engage in monstrous behavior. We have seen its manipulation of commodities markets, the way it has pillaged many nations and ripped away sovereignty from many. Yet for millennia, we have seen the same process. A new social order is created, new obligations and new relationships. A new ruling class rises, and along with this, a new financial order begins. Over time, things become too imbalanced. The old systems cease to work. What the system was designed to do is now irrelevant, and what it does is self-destructive. All of the obligations in the system become too onerous. They become impossible, and they become impossible to believe. For what is debt really, if just a promise? And what happens as a social system decays? Promises become unbelievable. This financial machine, which has hopped from nation to nation, from colony to colony, and host to host, has always sought the same avenue: use war to take assets and recollateralize, or destroy its host, and in the chaos, offer a forgiveness of debt in exchange for the last of the assets, absconding to do it all again. Yet this machine itself, or at least this instantiation of it, may be at its end. There is nowhere else to go. There are no more hosts. And it may be, as it always has been, a new social agreement must be formed. The old debts become recognized as impossible. And ultimately, in a time of great conflict, the old mechanisms fall down under the weight of their own incredibility. Thus, in its place, a new agreement is formed, a new system arises. We have seen again and again the expansion of taxation, the creation of new debt instruments, these being used to strengthen the financial institutions, and that further financializing the society. And when this no longer can sustain itself, the monetary regime changes to do it all over again. Nothing lasts forever, and now there are only a few ways out. But ultimately, all of the conditions have been met. The old obligations are no longer believable. There is no more financialization to be done. The old social arrangements no longer work, and the story of the system itself is no longer believed. So what's next? Where can we go from here? Well, the machine appears to wish to hop away, as it always has, absconding with the wealth of the old host. Yet today looks different. Taking a look first at London, let's look at its options. The United Kingdom appears poised to implement a digital pound and capital controls. One avenue that appears to be being investigated is the idea of simply locking the money in. There has already been a great deal of capital flight, and particularly as the British gilt has been being propped up with artificial GDP via mass migration, this appears to be more of a band-aid. Control the money of the people, direct it where you want, and use mass migration and cheap labor to hope to maintain the image of a real economy. Yet this has become too evident. While the United Kingdom does appear to be going in the direction of more and more control, with over 10,000 arrests for speech violations each year, and the announcement of a digital ID system. Lock it all down and fake it appears to be what they're going for. There is also the option of collapse, particularly if they are able to engineer a war, whether internally or against Russia. Then this would allow them the pretense for default. Britain needs a war. It absolutely requires a war. And looking at the United Kingdom now, and just how enthusiastic they are for conflict with the Russians, all while making agreements with the Ukrainians, agreements to take their resources, a wealth, collapse, and recollateralization with foreign assets, with the dream of taking Russia's wealth and forming a Ukrainian colony, appears to be what they hope to do. This would be in line with what has occurred over and over. War and recollateralization is a constant. On the part of the London financial machine, it appears as though they have been trying to leave, to set up shop in Dubai or Singapore. Yet this has been largely unsuccessful, and the Americans too have been blocking them. So now, at least a great deal of London is stuck in the United Kingdom with the rest of the people. Do they foment domestic conflict? Use this as a justification for further crackdowns and heavy-handed control? Do they implement capital controls in an effort to keep the money in? And do they get their war with Russia, seizing assets and trying to restart the credit system anew? Or this could all end. This could break down. The mass influx could be remigrated, and while the underlying enormous obligations like the pension system or the NHS would still be a problem that would not be solved, leading to what would likely be a period of economic and financial hardship, the country would be able to reindustrialize. It would be able to rebuild under a new social arrangement. A new order could be instantiated, and it could restart, free from this parasitic entity. Europe appears to be going with the digital euro and capital controls method as well. It has increasingly been taking more and more authoritarian control into its hands, overturning elections, imposing draconian speech laws, stifling political opposition with force, and increasingly locking down capital. Europe is in a very precarious situation, as they have a common currency, but separate sovereign debts. The euro has artificially mispriced the currency of all member nations, and while the ECB attempts to force buying of European bonds, particularly the German Bund, its rates have been artificially low, yet dissent has grown too large. The system is fundamentally losing legitimacy, and Europe, just as Britain, needs a war with Russia. They too want those assets, and particularly as assets seized on Euroclear from the Russians has become a major point of contention, raising questions as to whether they have already spent the frozen assets. Europe must have a war. They must have capital controls. They must default, recollateralize, and reset. And while their internal crisis and illegitimacy is astronomically expanding, there doesn't appear to be any future where the European Union continues to exist. So do they go all in? Does the unelected EU bureaucracy seize total control? Do the national debts enter default, with the ECB issuing new obligations? Do they get a war? Do they conscript their young men and send them off to die in the East? And as with the United Kingdom, what of the internal conflict from migration? Do they use this to justify a heavier and heavier police state, forming a true draconian EU body? Or does the EU split apart, with the member nations reasserting their independence? Regardless of what happens, there are no paths forward where the system continues as it is. The legitimacy is dead, the social order no longer holds, and the debts appear to be on the verge of simply collapsing. The only way out is war. The United States is in the most unique position. Those financial entities that have long maintained control in the United States appear to be fomenting chaos. Regional blocks of governors forming. It appears quite evident that there are interests who want the United States broken apart. But will this happen? Will there be a major internal conflict? One thing which is quite unique about the United States is that if there is a major debt crisis in the United Kingdom or Europe, it is most likely that that capital will rush into the United States. In a global credit crisis, the United States comes out on top. In previous years, the goals seem to be a war in Eastern Europe and a coordinated default across the West, all reissuing debt together and under central bank digital currencies. Yet the powers of the United States appear to be in conflict, and at least to a great extent, those outcomes appear to be less and less likely, as those in opposition have achieved more power. If the United States does achieve sovereignty from this system, then it will still need to address its fiscal position. One avenue that appears to be being implemented is the use of stablecoins to increase the market for US Treasuries. As stablecoin adoption increases worldwide, the issuers must buy one-to-one treasuries to back all of those coins, creating a larger market for government debt. As well, the ever-spiraling system of perpetual debt and taxes that has long drained the population is coming into question, while the government acquires more equity positions and achieves national cash flows from assets. What appears to be being set up is a system where the United States can fund its obligations off of real assets. Real assets like its natural resources, and the rights thereof, as well as major national industries. So, does the United States enter a civil war? Does that old financial system abscond? Does the United States regionalize, with some parts remaining on the old system, using war and asset seizures in a desperate attempt to reset? Or does the United States become sovereign of this? Does the United States return to its system of political economy? There is much up in the air in the United States, and it is a major point of conflict, as so much wealth and power is on the line. The United States could become something much more like what it used to be, or it could go down with the European ship. Time will tell what will happen. It could be dragged into a foreign war. Internal conflict could become so stark that it breaks up, or perhaps this will all end, and the United States will go forward with industry and a recapitalized middle class. Either way, it's a big fight, and either way, business as it has been is over. We have seen this again and again, sometimes minor resets, and sometimes entire overhauls of the system, creating a new social order. The one that we are in appears to be a major overhaul. There's so much noise and narrative. There's so much propaganda out there. But if one can cut through the propagandistic chatter that is attempting to distract, then the fundamental conflict is quite evident. There is a battle for the future of the system, and the entrenched powers that have existed for centuries are in a very dangerous place as the extend and pretend comes to an end. I can't say what the future will be, but we should watch closely the moves that are being made, as the outcome of this debt reset, of this social reordering, will doubtlessly define lifetimes to come.